Hey guys, today we began What Did They Do with the Dead After Medieval Battles? So before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's ease into the journey together. Did you know that in some medieval battles, up to 1/3 of all fighting men died in a single afternoon? Imagine standing on a field where thousands of bodies lie silent, armor still warm, and the smell of blood, mud, and smoke hangs in the air. Now here's the real question. What happened next? What did they actually do with all the dead after medieval battles? Burn them? Bury them? Leave them for scavengers? Or something far more shocking? Let's step into that moment, right after the chaos ends, when the shouting fades and only the wind moves through the long grass. Because the story of what happened after the fighting is often darker, more heartbreaking, and more revealing than the battle itself. Before we dive deep, let's start with a few key facts that will anchor our journey. Between the years 1000 and 1500, Europe saw over 1,500 recorded battles, from small skirmishes to brutal clashes like the Battle of Toten, where an estimated 28,000 men died in a single day. After battles like these, the living face a terrifying, overwhelming challenge: clearing the dead before disease, scavengers, or enemy raiders returned. Medieval people didn't have modern burial crews, trucks, or equipment. They had their hands, desperation, and whatever tools happened to survive the fight. And here's the part most people never realize. The cleanup of the dead was often more exhausting and emotionally crushing than the battle itself. Soldiers who had just escaped death had to walk among the bodies of friends, brothers, and even their own lords. The psychological impact was enormous, but the work had to be done quickly. So let's go deeper. Let's step into that moment, right after a medieval battle ends. The battle has stopped. For hours, maybe for the entire day, thousands of men clash with swords, spears, maces, and arrows. But as the sun starts to sink or the clouds of dust finally settle, an eerie stillness replaces the screams. Survivors stand frozen at first, breathing hard, gripping their weapons with trembling hands. Many of them don't even realize the fighting has ended. Their ears ring, their bodies shake, and there is this hollow silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded who haven't yet slipped away. It is in this moment that commanders get one of the hardest orders of medieval warfare: sort the living from the dead. This was the first step, and believe it or not, it wasn't simple. Many wounded men were mistaken for corpses. Some dead soldiers were still alive hours later. Chroniclers write of men lying in piles of bodies who suddenly moved or called out when someone stepped on them. Others were buried or burned while still breathing, because the chaos made it almost impossible to check everyone properly. Once the living were gathered, treated, or carried away, the real work began: handling the dead. This was brutal, slow, and emotionally crushing. Now, let's look closely at who actually did this work. It wasn't priests. It wasn't professional crews. Most of the time, the people moving bodies were soldiers themselves, the very same men who had survived. These were exhausted, traumatized fighters who had to gather the bodies of enemies, allies, and sometimes even family members. Imagine lifting heavy bodies still locked in stiff armor, soaked in blood, often mangled beyond recognition. Imagine seeing the face of someone you trained beside, shared a meal with, joked with just the night before. But time was short. They had to work fast because medieval people feared disease spreading from the dead. While we know now that corpses don't spread plagues easily, people in the Middle Ages lived with constant outbreaks of disease and didn't want to take chances. So there was a sense of urgency: get bodies underground or burn before nightfall if possible. But how do you bury thousands of men with only shovels, or sometimes no tools at all? This is where medieval ingenuity, desperation, and harsh practicality all collide. In some battles, the dead were dragged into massive pits, often dug right on the battlefield. These pits could be shallow or deep depending on the terrain and the exhaustion of the survivors. Bodies were stripped of valuables, armor, and boots before burial because metal was expensive and nothing was wasted in medieval war. Chroniclers describe fields where soldiers worked silently, pulling off helmets, chainmail, and gauntlets, stacking equipment in piles while bodies lay in growing heaps nearby. In other cases, when armies didn't have time or simply didn't care enough, bodies were left where they fell. This happened especially when the dead belonged to the enemy. Nature took over. Wolves, dogs, ravens, and even wild boars came to feed. Some medieval writers describe entire hillsides turning black with flocks of crows feasting on the fallen. The stench could travel miles. Travelers avoided roads near old battlefields for weeks. And yet, despite the horror, there were moments of deep humanity too. In certain cultures, especially among knights and nobles, fallen high-ranking warriors were given special treatment. Their bodies were retrieved, cleaned, clothed, and sent home for burial, even if it meant negotiating temporary truces between enemies. Honor mattered. Reputation mattered, even in death. But the most unbelievable thing? Sometimes the living didn't bury the dead at all. They took specific parts of them home for burial, most commonly the heart or bones. The body was too heavy or foul-smelling, or too far from home to transport whole. So armies boiled corpses in huge cauldrons to remove flesh from bone. Then the clean bones were wrapped and shipped back to families. This practice was especially popular among crusaders who died far from Europe. You might be wondering, how often did armies actually burn the dead? We imagine giant pyres from movies, but in reality burning bodies was extremely rare. It required enormous amounts of wood, far more than people usually had access to after a battle. Burning hundreds or thousands of bodies could strip an entire forest. So burials, pits, or simply leaving bodies were much more common. As darkness fell on a battlefield, the scene was haunting. Survivors still worked, using torches or moonlight to finish the job. Wolves howled in the distance. The air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke. And throughout the night, wounded men cried out for help or begged for water. Some armies sent monks or priests to walk the field, offering last rites to the dying. Others simply left them to fate. And through all this, one question hangs in the air, one that will guide us deeper in the next part of our story. When medieval soldiers looked across a battlefield filled with the dead, did they see tragedy or just another cost of war? The battlefield doesn't sleep. Even after the fighting has ended and the sun slips away, the work of the living continues through the night. In the fading light, soldiers move slowly and carefully, stepping between bodies, listening for any faint moan that might signal a survivor. The ground beneath their boots feels uneven, not mud, not stone, but the forms of men who had stood beside them hours earlier. And the smell, medieval chroniclers often wrote that the stench of a battlefield was something a man never forgot for the rest of his life. To understand what happened with the dead after medieval battles, we first need to understand the complexity of sorting them. It wasn't a simple matter of dead or alive. Many soldiers were unconscious, wounded, or in shock. Some were covered by other bodies, trapped underneath piles of fallen men. Others were so drenched in blood that you couldn't tell whose wounds belonged to whom. Soldiers sometimes grabbed a body to move it, only for the man to gasp or cry out, startling everyone around him. The sorting process often took hours, even in smaller battles. In massive confrontations like the Battle of Visby or the Battle of Crécy, it could take days. Imagine that. 2 or 3 days after the fighting, the field still crawling with men carrying torches, checking pulse after pulse, calling out to see if anyone answered. Some warriors stayed alive for days among the dead, barely conscious. Medieval stories tell of men who survived by drinking rainwater collected in dents of armor or by sheer stubbornness after being left for dead. But most of the wounded weren't so lucky. Without modern medicine, wounds that would be treatable today, like simple cuts or broken bones, could turn fatal in a matter of hours. Once the living were finally separated and taken away, the soldiers moved to the next brutal stage, stripping the dead. Armor was valuable, sometimes more valuable than the soldier wearing it. Even poor quality armor took months to make and cost more than a common labor earned in a year. After a battle, stripping the dead wasn't disrespectful. It was expected. Nobles would often recover their armor with pride, and lower-ranked soldiers saw battlefield loot as a rightful reward for surviving. So imagine this scene. Survivors kneel beside bodies, working in silence. They unbuckle belts, untie straps, and slide off chainmail shirts that cling to bodies like heavy wet blankets. They remove boots, helmets, gauntlets, and pouches. Rings and necklaces are taken, too. Anything of value. This part of the process could be emotionally devastating. Soldiers often found themselves holding items that belonged to close friends. And yet, they couldn't stop. They couldn't rest. Because the dead had to be cleared before the next day. And so the next step begins, piling the bodies. Medieval chronicles describe bodies stacked in long rows, sometimes sorted by rank or nationality. Allies in one pile, enemies in another. Nobles were separated out so their retainers or families could identify and collect them later. Some bodies were laid out with arms crossed, a sign of respect. Others were heaped together like firewood, especially when there were simply too many. Now, let's talk about something most people don't imagine when thinking about medieval battles. Mass graves. If you've ever seen archaeological digs at medieval battlefields, you'll know exactly what they found. Giant pits holding hundreds of men. Many of these pits were shallow, often just deep enough to keep animals from digging up the remains. Digging deep graves by hand was extremely difficult, especially for exhausted survivors. The soil was often rocky, frozen, or too wet. Soldiers used anything they could as shovels, broken shields, helmets, even pieces of wood. Picture the scene. Hundreds of men working together to move bodies into pits. They carry them by the arms and feet, or drag them using ropes. The air is filled with grunts, the scraping of metal, the sound of bodies landing one after another. Some soldiers whisper prayers. Others cry silently, and some simply stare into nothing, numb from shock. When the pits were full, the soldiers covered the bodies with dirt, rocks, or branches. Some armies placed a wooden cross over the grave. Others left nothing at all. Time and weather eventually erased all traces of the burial, leaving the land silent once again. But not all bodies were buried. In many battles, particularly when the dead were enemies or belonged to a despised group, the bodies were left where they fell. This happened often after civil wars, raids, or battles involving mercenaries. In medieval France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, despised mercenary groups like the Routiers or free companies were often denied burial entirely. What happened then? Nature took over. Ravens, crows, wolves, and wild dogs were the first to arrive. Medieval writers describe fields turning black with birds, tearing open bodies and scattering bones. Wolves sometimes dug up shallow graves. In some regions, peasants burned the remains weeks later to stop the smell from drifting into towns. The psychological impact of seeing a battlefield weeks after a battle was profound. Travelers wrote of walking across fields where bones stuck out of the soil like pale branches. Some said they could still smell the blood months later. And occasionally, pieces of armor or personal items lay half buried, silent reminders of the men who died there. But let's step away from the mass graves for a moment and focus on one particular group, the nobility. Knights and nobles were treated very differently after battles. Their bodies were valuable, not just for ransom, but for honor. Families wanted them returned home for proper burial. But the problem was distance. If a knight died hundreds or thousands of miles away, his body couldn't simply be transported home whole. It would rot long before reaching its destination. So medieval armies developed an astonishing method: body processing. Yes, you heard that right. Noble bodies were sometimes boiled in large cauldrons to separate flesh from bone. The bones were then cleaned, perfumed, wrapped, and transported home. The flesh could be buried locally, often near the site of the battle or in a monastery. This practice was common among crusaders, European knights who died in the Holy Land. Their bones traveled across deserts, seas, and mountains before finally reaching family tombs. But what about the ordinary soldier who didn't have wealth or rank? His fate depended on who won the battle, how tired the survivors were, and what kind of terrain they were in. Some were buried with dignity. Others were thrown into pits. Many were simply abandoned. And yet, this wasn't always seen as cruel. In medieval culture, especially for peasants and lower-ranking fighters, dying on the field of battle was considered an honorable end. Many believed their souls would find their way home, even if their bodies remained on foreign soil. Now, let's move into another overlooked aspect: the spiritual dimension. Medieval people feared dying without last rites. Soldiers begged to be confessed before battle, and after the fighting, priests walked the field offering blessings to the dying. Priests also blessed mass graves, even if hurriedly. A battlefield wasn't just a place of death. It became a temporary, makeshift cemetery. Some battles, like Hastings or Agincourt, had chaplains who tried to pray over the dead long after sunset. And yet, the question remains, what did it feel like? What did it feel like for a survivor to walk through all this? Imagine you're a young man, maybe 18 or 20. You came to battle full of excitement, maybe even pride. You dreamed of glory. You believed in your Lord, your King, your cause. But now the fighting is done, and you're walking among bodies of people you knew, people you argued with, people you laughed with. The field is quiet, but filled with death. You don't feel like a hero. You feel numb. You realize something essential about medieval warfare. The battle was only half the horror. The aftermath was the other half. And what happened in those silent hours after victory or defeat shaped the culture, the memory, and the trauma of medieval soldiers far more than any sword strike. As dawn breaks over a medieval battlefield, the light reveals what the torches could not. In the cold gray of early morning, soldiers see the true scale of the destruction. The piles of bodies, the scattered weapons, the pools of dry blood, the churned earth. It all looks different in daylight, more real, more permanent. If you've ever woken up after a nightmare and still felt shaken, imagine waking up inside the nightmare. This moment, right after sunrise, was often when the reality of what needed to be done hit the survivors hardest. The adrenaline of battle was gone. The numbness of shock had worn off, and all that remained was a heavy, unglamorous burden of dealing with the dead. And medieval commanders knew they had only one day, maybe two, to clear the field before disease, scavengers, or the enemy returned. There was no time to hesitate. So the work began again. Let's step into the morning after the battle. The ground is still damp with dew, but that dew mixes with blood and mud, creating a thick, sticky layer that clings to boots. Ravens circle overhead, cawing loudly, waiting for soldiers to leave. A few dogs roam around the edges, sniffing cautiously, tails low. The first job is identifying the noble dead. This matters enormously in medieval society, not only for ritual and family honor, but also for political stability. A nobleman's death could shift alliances, disrupt inheritances, spark rebellions, or reshape a kingdom. That's how important it was. So, soldiers moved carefully to the field looking for distinctive armor, fine cloaks, special emblems, ornate swords, or heraldic symbols painted on shields. In some cases, squires or servants follow behind, hoping, sometimes dreading, to find their master's body. If they do, they wail or kneel beside him, grief overwhelming them. Chroniclers describe grown men breaking down completely at this stage. If a noble's body is found, it is laid aside respectfully. A small guard is posted, even if only symbolically. Sometimes bodies are washed in nearby streams. In Christian Europe, this washing was considered essential, a way of preparing the soul for the afterlife. It was also practical. A clean body was easier to transport. For high-ranking nobles, their armor might be removed and preserved. Their bodies could be wrapped in cloth, placed on carts, or carried by followers. If the family had money, arrangements for transport began almost immediately. If the noble died far from home, his followers might build a temporary shrine, marking the place where ceremonies or prayers would be held before the journey. But ordinary soldiers had no such honors. Their bodies were often dragged together into larger piles. And here's something that might shock you. Medieval armies did not always bury enemy dead. In some cases, especially after particularly brutal wars, the enemy's bodies were left intentionally unburied as an act of humiliation or revenge. This wasn't done everywhere, but when it happened, it sent a clear message. And why? Because burial was a deeply spiritual act. To deny someone burial was to condemn their memory. But most of the time, even enemy soldiers ended up in mass graves, simply because the smell and pest risk forced the victors to act. The living had no choice. Let's walk through the next stage. Digging the graves. Soldiers, camp followers, peasants from nearby villages, anyone who could use a shovel was pulled into this task. But digging was exhausting. Medieval tools weren't efficient, and the soil might be rocky or compact. A pit for hundreds of bodies could take hours, or even an entire day to complete. Sometimes multiple smaller pits were dug instead of one huge one. Other times, natural depressions or trenches were used. And in desperate situations, bodies were simply stacked in ditches created by the battle itself. Arrow pits, siege trenches, collapsed earthworks, all these became graves. And then came the part that stayed with survivors forever, moving the bodies. A body in armor can weigh over 180 pounds, 80 plus kg. Even without armor, a dead body is surprisingly heavy and limp. Soldiers often grab bodies by the wrists or ankles, dragging them across rough ground. This could tear clothing, dislocate limbs, or cause armor to scrape loudly across soil and stones. The sound of dragging bodies was described by one chronicler as a sound that haunts the soul. Imagine that. The sound of armor scraping, of chainmail rattling, of bodies thumping into pits, echoing across a field. As bodies were moved, soldiers sometimes recognized faces. A friend, a cousin, a man from their village. Some stopped to whisper a prayer. Others froze for a moment, staring in disbelief. But they always returned to the work, because they had no choice. Medieval people were far more familiar with death than we are today, but the scale of death was overwhelming even for them. Now, let's talk about something rarely mentioned: the clothing and personal items of the dead. Not everything was taken. Armor and weapons were valuable, so those were removed. But clothing, unless particularly fine, was often left on the bodies. When soldiers dragged them to the pits, the fabric tore. Belts snapped. Shoes fell off. By the time bodies reached the graves, they were often naked or half-dressed. Before bodies went into the pit, priests, if any were present, would bless the grave. Sometimes a quick Latin prayer was all they had time for. Other times, if the battle was small or the weather mild, priests would say longer rites. But in many battles, especially during wars like the 100 Years' War, there were no priests available. Burial became purely practical. Get the bodies underground before they rot. And speaking of rot, let's confront one of the harshest truths. Bodies decomposed extremely fast on battlefields. Within hours, rigor mortis set in, making bodies stiff and hard to move. By the next day, the stiffness faded and bodies became loose again, but the smell intensified. In summer, under the open sun, decomposition accelerated so quickly that soldiers sometimes felt sick just walking near the bodies. This is why armies worked with such urgency. They didn't need knowledge of bacteria to understand instinctively that dead bodies were dangerous. Now, here's something people often overlook. Animals didn't wait. Scavengers arrived almost immediately. Wolves and bears came during the night. Birds descended even while soldiers were still working. Medieval men were used to wildlife, but seeing animals tearing at their fallen comrades was deeply disturbing. Chroniclers write of soldiers shouting and waving torches, trying to drive the creatures away, while waiting for the grave pits to be ready. But even once the bodies were finally inside the graves, the work wasn't done. Soldiers had to cover them with dirt, often using shields or broken spears to push soil into the pit. Sometimes they stacked rocks on top. In unusually respectful burials, wooden crosses or markers were placed. But most mass graves had no markings at all. When the last body was buried and the last grave covered, the battlefield began to transform. Supplies were gathered. Captured weapons were sorted. Armor was repaired. And slowly, the army prepared to move on, sometimes within a single day. But for the soldiers who survived, the battlefield never left their minds. The smell, the faces, the weight of the dead in their arms. These memories followed them home, into their villages, into their old age. In medieval diaries and letters, veterans describe reliving battlefields in their dreams years later. And this is where we uncover another hidden truth. Medieval warfare didn't just destroy bodies. It scarred the souls of the living. But the story doesn't end with simple burial or abandonment. Some cultures practiced surprising rituals. Some kings demanded unusual treatments. Some religious groups had strict rules. And some armies developed methods far more elaborate and sometimes more gruesome than anything we've covered so far. Because handling the dead wasn't just a practical task. It was political. It was spiritual. It was symbolic. And in Part 4, we're going to dive into the rituals, beliefs, and cultural differences that shaped how entire civilizations treated the fallen, and how those practices changed the course of medieval history itself. When we talk about medieval battles, we often imagine swords clashing, arrows flying, and armored knights thundering across a field. But what we rarely picture is a quiet, emotional, deeply symbolic world that came after fighting. And in this part of the story, we're going to explore something that shaped everything about how medieval people treated the dead. Beliefs, rituals, spiritual fears, cultural expectations, and the powerful weight of religion, because handling the dead wasn't just about clearing a battlefield. It was about helping souls cross into the afterlife, honoring ancestors, protecting family reputations, and maintaining the balance of society. For medieval people, the dead weren't just bodies. They were spirits, memories, obligations, and in some cases, warnings. Let's begin with the most influential force in medieval Europe, Christianity. The belief that the soul needed proper rites to reach heaven shaped almost every decision made after a battle. The church taught that the dead needed prayers, blessings, and, ideally, burial in consecrated ground. But battlefields weren't consecrated. They were violent, bloody, and chaotic places, far from the quiet, holy spaces where Christians expected to be laid to rest. This created a spiritual crisis for many soldiers. Men prayed before battle not just for victory, but so they would not die unshriven, without confession. If they died without forgiveness, their souls were believed to be at risk. So after battle, priests moved across the field offering whatever comfort they could. Some whispered prayers over entire heaps of bodies, hoping mass absolution would be enough. Others blessed the pits after burials. But the truth is, on some battlefields, there were no priests at all. Soldiers died without rites, without blessing, without any ceremony except a hurried show of soil over their bodies. This frightened medieval people deeply. They feared ghosts, restless spirits, and the idea that souls trapped between worlds might haunt the living. And so even when resources were scarce, armies tried to do something, anything, to honor the dead, even if it was symbolic. Sometimes soldiers would place a coin in a dead man's hand. Sometimes a small wooden cross was carved from a broken spear. Sometimes a helmet was turned upside down and placed on a pole to mark a noble's temporary grave. These gestures mattered. They weren't just symbolic. They were seen as helping the soul find its way. But rituals varied across cultures. Let's explore some of the most fascinating differences. Norse and Germanic traditions. Before Christianity took full hold, Norse and Germanic warriors believed the dead needed to reach Valhalla or other afterlife realms. Death in battle was sacred. A warrior who died with his weapon in hand was honored. But if his body was left to rot or scavengers ate it, the soul was believed to lose its path. So earlier traditions encouraged weapon burials, burying the dead with swords or shields. Burning the dead. Cremation purified the body and released the spirit. Mound burials, large burial mounds that signaled the person's importance. But by the high Middle Ages, cremation fell out of favor in Christian Europe. Still, echoes of these old beliefs influenced how soldiers treated their fallen comrades. A warrior might insist his sword be placed with him. A commander might build a mound for especially honored dead. These traditions didn't disappear. They blended into Christian practices over time. Islamic medieval warfare. On the opposite side of many medieval conflicts, especially during the Crusades, Muslim armies followed specific burial rules based on Islamic law. The dead would be washed, wrapped in simple cloth, and buried facing Mecca. But the sheer chaos of battle made this difficult. Yet Muslim armies were often more organized in post-battle rituals. Commanders regularly ordered systematic burials, even for small clashes. They believed burying the dead quickly was a duty, not just a fallen but to God. There are records of Muslim generals pausing campaigns to ensure all bodies were buried before marching on. This contrasted with many European armies, which often left enemy dead behind. Byzantine traditions. The Byzantine Empire had a unique approach. They viewed the dead as both spiritual and political symbols. After battle, their soldiers often sang hymns as they gathered bodies. They collected relics, preserved pieces of armor, or built memorial churches. The Byzantines saw warfare as deeply tied to divine purpose. A victory wasn't just military, it was spiritual confirmation. When thousands died in a single battle, the Byzantines sometimes built bone chapels or ossuaries where clean bones were stacked neatly, often for generations. These sites became sacred places, reminders of sacrifice. What about Eastern Europe and the steppes? Mongols, Cumans, and other steppe cultures treated battlefield dead differently. They believed death in battle was honorable, but rituals varied widely. Sometimes bodies were left on the field intentionally, offered to nature and sky spirits. Other times, warriors carried bones of family members with them, believing it brought protection. The Mongols, for example, were famously practical. They didn't linger on battlefields unless necessary. They stripped armor, took valuable items, and moved on. Their dead were typically buried in small, hidden graves. They didn't mark graves because they believed disturbing the dead brought misfortune. For this reason, very few Mongol graves have been found. Shared superstitions. Across cultures, medieval soldiers shared one common belief. Battlefields were haunted. They believed ghosts lingered where men died violently. Travelers avoided battlefields at night. Soldiers who camped near old battle sites reported hearing cries, clashing metal, or footsteps in the dark. These weren't just folk tales. They were shaped by the trauma soldiers carried. Imagine hearing the wind whistle through a broken helmet on the ground. Imagine walking past a mound where 1,000 men were buried and feeling the weight of their silence. Medieval people didn't have psychology or trauma studies. They explained fear through spirits. This fear shaped rituals, shaped respect, and shaped how urgently the dead were removed. Political motivations behind burial. Not all burials were about respect or spiritual need. Sometimes kings had political reasons. Burying enemies quickly meant preventing rebellions fueled by grief. Honoring fallen nobles reinforced loyalty. Building grand tombs created propaganda. The Battle of Hastings, for example, wasn't just a military turning point. It reshaped burial politics. Legend says King Harold's body was treated differently from other soldiers. Some chroniclers claim his mistress Edith identified him. Others say he was buried on an unmarked cliff. These stories weren't just about burial. They were statements of power. When a king or great noble died in battle, their burial decided how they'd be remembered. Entire armies paused, even in enemy territory, to recover noble bodies because failing to do so could spark crises at home. Now let's look at one of the most shocking practices: disarticulation and transport. We touched on this earlier, but now it's time to go deeper. When nobles died far from home, especially during crusades, their bodies could not be transported intact. Heat and decay made long journeys impossible. So armies developed a method known as mos teutonicus, the German custom. The process was unsettling. The noble's body was boiled in wine, vinegar, or water, flesh separated from bone. Bones were cleaned, dried, and wrapped. Sometimes the heart or internal organs were preserved separately. The remains were carried hundreds or thousands of miles home. To modern ears, this sounds horrific, but to medieval people, it was an act of deep respect. Families wanted the bones of their ancestors in family tombs. Knights wanted to rest beside their ancestors. Churches wanted to honor fallen crusaders. In some cases, nobles had multiple burials. Their bones in one place, their heart in another, their entrails in a third. This wasn't strange to them. It was a spiritual strategy. Every culture had its own logic, but all shared one truth. Handling the dead mattered profoundly. The dust is settled, the bodies have been buried or gathered, and the battlefield is finally quiet. But the true aftermath of medieval warfare is only beginning, because while the dead no longer speak, the living must carry everything: fear, grief, trauma, and the responsibility of explaining what happened to families, lords, kings, and entire communities waiting far from the battlefield. This part of the story explores something many forget. How did the living cope with what they saw? What happened when they returned home? How did medieval society absorb the shock of mass death? And how did those emotions shape laws, rituals, legends, and even religion? Let's step into the shoes of a survivor. You've marched for weeks, fought for hours, and spent the night dragging bodies into pits. Your hands are blistered. Your armor is dented. You've seen things you'll never forget: the twisted limbs, the blank stares, the cries of the dying, the smell of blood mixing with mud and sweat. Now, imagine walking away from the battlefield. Behind you lies everything you just survived. Ahead of you are villages, cities, farmlands, and people who have no idea what you've seen. The weight of this emotional distance is something medieval chroniclers struggled to describe. But they tried. Some wrote of soldiers who returned home and fell silent for days. Others wrote of men who burst into tears at the sight of their own children, overwhelmed that they had survived. Some wrote of men who avoided sleep because dreams dragged them back to the battlefield. Medieval society didn't have a word for trauma, but they knew it existed. The emotional aftershocks, unspoken but everywhere. The living carried deep wounds that weren't visible. Medieval soldiers often blamed themselves for not saving friends. Some believed the dead appeared in dreams, calling for prayers. Others felt guilt for stripping bodies or burying them hastily. Priests described soldiers confessing with trembling voices, terrified they had sinned by looting a corpse or failing to help a wounded comrade. And because religion shaped everything in the Middle Ages, many thought battle trauma was spiritual punishment or a test of faith. Some soldiers began giving more money to churches. Some went on pilgrimages. Some changed occupations entirely. War changed men. And medieval society expected it. Communities waiting at home. Imagine a village waiting for news. The men marched months ago. No one knows who lived or died. Then a lone rider appears on a road. Behind him, banners. And behind the banners, a group of weary survivors. Mothers rush to the square. Wives cry out. Children cling to fathers returning home. The joy is overwhelming, but grief lurks behind it, because not every man returns. In many villages, women line up to ask soldiers, "Did you see my brother? Did he fall quickly? Did he suffer? Did he call my name? Where did he die? Was he buried?" This was one of the most emotionally crushing responsibilities survivors carried, describing the deaths of friends of their families. Sometimes they softened the truth. Sometimes they lied to spare pain. Sometimes they told brutal honesty because the family wanted to know every detail. And when the answer to "where is he buried" was "in a pit," the weight of grief was immense. Families in medieval Europe walked for days or weeks to visit the battlefield graves of their loved ones. These sites became places of pilgrimage. Even if the grave was unmarked, even if the body could never be found, families came to pray. And this led to something unexpected: battlefields becoming memorial landscapes. Long before modern monuments, medieval people returned to battlefields to honor their dead. The legal aftermath: death changed everything. Death in battle didn't only affect emotions, it affected property, inheritance, and law. When a noble died, everything changed. Lands had to be transferred. Children or cousins became heirs. Widows received pensions or dowries. Vassals had to swear loyalty to new lords. Kings reassigned territories, castles, and duties. But here's the twist. If a noble's body wasn't recovered, disputes erupted. Some families refused to accept death without proof. This sometimes caused legal battles that lasted years. And in rare cases, impostors appeared, men claiming to be long-lost nobles who had somehow survived. Entire estates hung on whether the body of the lord was identified on the battlefield. Common soldiers faced their own bureaucratic realities. If a peasant died in war, his family might lose land, income, or protection. Widows were left with uncertain futures, and orphans depended on charity. Medieval society had no pensions, no insurance, no safety nets. War didn't end when soldiers laid down their swords. It continued in the homes and fields of every affected family. How soldiers remembered the dead: songs, stories, and silence. Medieval people didn't just forget the dead. They immortalized them. Soldiers sang songs about fallen comrades. Minstrels composed ballads recounting heroic deaths. Chroniclers wrote pages honoring great knights. Villages added names to church records. Families lit candles for the dead each year. Pilgrims carried the names of the fallen to holy sites. Some men kept tokens, a friend's dagger, ring, scrap of cloth. These items became sacred. They weren't just souvenirs. They were anchors of memory. But many soldiers carried something darker, the silence of things they refused to speak about. We know this because medieval texts describe veterans as brooding chains, shadowed, or withdrawn. These writings reveal the unspoken truth. Survivors struggle with trauma, depression, and nightmares, just as soldiers do today. From battlefield to legend, some medieval battles produce stories that live for centuries. Take Hastings, or Agincourt, or the Battle of the Golden Spurs, or the Siege of Antioch. Each of these spawned legends about heroism, but also legends about the dead. People said the ghost of Hastings wandered the hills for years. Locals at Agincourt claimed to see strange lights where bodies were buried. Villagers near Visby whispered of hearing footsteps at night along the mass graves. Whether these stories were supernatural or reflections of trauma doesn't matter. They shaped how medieval people saw battlefields as sacred, haunted, sorrowful spaces. And sometimes entire shrines were built on the sites of major battles. Not honor victory, but to honor the dead, the spiritual payback, prayer, penance, and fear of judgment. For medieval Christians, dying violently was spiritually dangerous, and burying someone improperly could doom their soul. So survivors felt responsible. They prayed for the dead constantly, donated money to churches for masses, sponsored candles or altars dedicated to the fallen, undertook pilgrimages as penance. Some kings even built monasteries near battlefields, so monks could pray for the dead every day, forever. This wasn't superstition. In their minds, it was a moral duty. They believed the dead watched them. They believed God judged how they treated the fallen. They believed the memory of the dead shaped their own future. By now we understand that dealing with the dead after medieval battles was not just a physical task. It was an emotional, legal, and spiritual journey that reshaped lives and communities. But we still haven't explored the most surprising part, the economic world that grew around battlefield death. Merchants, scavengers, bone collectors, ransom brokers, and even medical examiners long before modern science be why now we've explored the physical, emotional, and spiritual world surrounding medieval battlefields. But there's another side, one people rarely talk about, yet it played a major role in what happened to the dead. The economy of the battlefield. It might sound strange, even inappropriate, but medieval warfare produced an entire ecosystem of workers, scavengers, merchants, and opportunists who appeared after battles, sometimes within hours. For them, the battlefield wasn't just a place of tragedy. It was a marketplace, a chance for income, a resource field, and whether people liked it or not, these individuals shaped what happened to the dead. Let's step into the shadowy world. The scavengers, the first to arrive. Long before official burial crews arrived, sometimes even before the armies finished leaving, scavengers moved in. These weren't necessarily criminals. Many were simply desperate peasants, refugees, or villagers trying to survive in a harsh world. They came to search for coins hidden in boots or belts, rings on fingers, buckles, daggers, or metal scraps, armor plates, crossbow bolts, pieces of chainmail, horses left wandering the field. But here's where things get darker. Scavengers often removed valuable items before soldiers buried the dead, and sometimes they were braver than soldiers themselves. They cut through clothing, dug fingers searching for rings, even pulled boots off stiff, decomposing feet. Some chroniclers complained that scavengers robbed the dead like wolves upon sheep. Others called them a necessary evil, because as unpleasant as it sounds, scavengers cleaned fields faster than armies could. They removed metal, leather, and equipment that otherwise would have rusted into the ground. In their own way, they sped up the burial process. But not every scavenger had good intentions. The bone collectors, the strangest post-battle profession. Here's one of the most shocking medieval truths. Battlefields became bone mines. In the late Middle Ages, bones, especially large ones like femurs, were valuable. They were burned to make fertilizer called bone meal. They were ground into powder for medicine. They were used in certain crafts. And where could you find huge quantities of bones? Old battlefields. Long after the flesh had decayed, bone collectors visited the sites, sometimes decades later, digging up pits, sifting soil, and carting away piles of human remains. Records from England, France, and Germany show that merchants collected bones from battles like Crécy, Poitiers, and Visby. They were loaded onto wagons, sold to farmers, shipped to cities, and even exported. Imagine that. Thousands of men die in battle, only for their bones to feed crops generations later. This wasn't disrespectful in their eyes. It was recycling, practical, resourceful. Medieval people lived hard lives and used every material available. But modern archaeologists sometimes find battlefields missing bones because they were harvested centuries earlier. Ransom brokers. Death had a price. When nobles died, their armor and items were worth fortunes. But ransom brokers, specialists in tracking noble identities, search bodies to see whether they carried signet rings, seals, insignias, letters, embroidered symbols. These indicated noble lineage. And nobles weren't just wealthy in life. They were valuable even in death. Because if a noble died, someone owed money. Widows, families, estates, kings, houses, tenants, military orders. Sometimes ransom agents went to battlefields specifically to verify noble deaths so debts could be collected. Imagine trying to identify a body among thousands when blood, dirt, and wounds disfigured nearly every face. That's why nobles' coats of arms, surcoats, and engraved armor mattered so much. They were the medieval version of ID tags. Merchants, selling to the dead. You might not believe this part, but medieval battlefields often turned into markets within days. Villagers arrived to sell food to the surviving soldiers, repair armor, mend clothing, offer horses, provide linen for bandages, sharpen swords for the next fight. And buried or not, the dead influenced prices. If a battle was massive and left behind mountains of weapons, the price of used swords or shields dropped for months. Conversely, shortages drove prices up before the next campaign. War wasn't just violence, it was an economy. Doctors and surgeons, the battlefield as a classroom. Most people think medical anatomy began in the Renaissance, but medieval surgeons learned more from battlefields than anywhere else. Some surgeons went to battlefields after the fighting to examine wounds, studying arrow paths, sword cuts, crushed bones, and blunt force injuries. These observations formed early medical texts. Surgeons didn't dissect bodies openly. Church rules made that difficult, but many doctors secretly studied wounded or dead soldiers on the field. They documented how deep a spear wound could penetrate, which blows were instantly fatal, how arrows fractured ribs, how helmet dents corresponded to skull damage. Some medical breakthroughs, especially in treating fractures, amputations, and infections, originated directly from battlefield observation. The dead, without choosing to, became teachers. The politics of rot and recovery. Kings and commanders didn't just bury the dead, they used the state of the battlefield for political storytelling. If a battlefield was cleaned quickly and smoothly, it showed strength and unity. If bodies rotted for weeks, it signaled chaos or weakness. Chronicles, poems, and songs describe how efficiently or poorly armies managed the dead because it reflected on leadership, organization, morality, divine favor. A field that still stank weeks later embarrassed rulers. A well-buried army honored its dead and its reputation. Even enemies judged each other based on how they handled the dead. Ghost merchants and battlefield rumors. When thousands die in one place, stories follow. Villagers sometimes collected relics, broken arrows, scraps of armor, even bones, claiming they had magical or protective properties. Some sold them as talismans. This led to a strange post-battle industry, where people purchased a tooth of a fallen knight, a piece of shield from a martyr of war, dried blood from a famous commander, a buckle said to belong to a crusader. To modern ears, this sounds bizarre, but relic culture dominated the Middle Ages. If saints' bones were holy, why not heroic warriors? The return to normalcy, or something like it. Once scavengers, merchants, clergy, soldiers, and villagers finished their work, the battlefield slowly returned to silence. Grass regrew, birds nested, farmers planted crops, but the soil remained different. Richer, darker, heavy with history, heavy with memory. Many medieval farmers refused to plow old battlefields, believing the land was cursed or sacred. Others found bones in their fields every spring, rising to the surface like reminders. Every plow blade that struck bone echoed the past. Every field enriched by bodies was seen as haunted, consecrated, or both. We've now explored the extraordinary world of medieval battlefield aftermath, from rituals to fear to economics. But the story isn't done yet. As generations passed and memories blurred, medieval battlefields transformed from bloody grounds into something else. Symbols, myths, lessons, warnings. The way medieval people treated the dead didn't just shape burial customs. It shaped entire cultures. And this part of the story explores how the memory of the dead after battles carved itself into law, folklore, religion, architecture, and the identity of whole kingdoms. Let's begin with something subtle but powerful. Battlefields became sacred without anyone planning it. In the Middle Ages, death itself carried a sacred weight, but thousands of violent deaths in a single place that turned battlefields into ghostly landscapes, neither fully holy nor entirely cursed. Pilgrims walked across them with quiet reverence. Families came seeking closure. Travelers lowered their voices, passing through at dusk. Priests urged prayer when crossing these lands. Kings avoided sleeping near them. These fields were not cemeteries, yet everyone treated them like sacred ground. Why? Because medieval people believed the dead stayed near the place where they died. Their souls lingered until properly prayed for. And since not all bodies were buried with rites, many people feared these fields held countless wandering spirits. This idea shaped culture in surprising ways. Laws began to protect battlefields as places of memory. By the 13th and 14th centuries, some kingdoms passed laws making it illegal to disturb battlefield graves. Even plowing fields where mass graves lay became taboo. Royals didn't want to be seen disrespecting the fallen, whether they were their own soldiers or even former enemies. In England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, charters started marking certain fields as resting places of warriors. Even if the graves were unmarked, the land was treated differently. It couldn't be sold easily. It couldn't be used for certain types of agriculture. It became frozen in time. We may think civilizations only protected tombs of kings or nobles, but medieval societies understood something deeper. A battlefield was a tomb for thousands, a memorial without a monument, a graveyard without gravestones. Stories became larger than life. Stories travel faster than facts, especially in times without printing presses. And so, memories of battles turn into legends, sometimes heroic, sometimes terrifying. Soldiers who buried the dead came home with tales. The crows darkened the sky. The bodies lay thicker than grass. The ground was slippery with blood. The dead spoke in the night. These phrases weren't just dramatic. They became the seeds of mythology. Ballads, poems, tavern stories, and fireside tales grew from these memories. Imagine a child hearing his grandfather describe the moans of dying men under the moonlight. That child grows up thinking of war not as glory, but as a place where the world itself seemed to cry. This influenced medieval thought profoundly. Even in cultures that celebrated warriors, the aftermath of battle humbled everyone. Ghost stories took root, and were taken seriously. Ghosts weren't entertainment in the Middle Ages. They were warnings. And battlefields were the most haunted places of all, according to countless medieval accounts. Travelers reported strange lights hovering above old burial pits, phantom armies marching at night, cries echoing across empty fields, visions of men searching for missing limbs, shadows that moved against the wind. These weren't just campfire tales. They appear in church records, monastery writings, and royal chronicles. Priests believed these ghosts were trapped souls, needing prayers to rest. Villagers believed disturbing battlefields brought punishment. So the dead shaped culture long after their bodies decayed. Fear turned memory into ritual. Prayer turned trauma into tradition. Monasteries and churches rose where the dead lay. Kings, nobles, and bishops often built monasteries near battlefields as acts of penance. Their goal was simple: ensure monks prayed for fallen forever. This happened after major battles like Hastings 1066, Bouvines 1214, Las Navas de Tolosa 1212, Largs 1263. Kosovo, 1389. Each monastery became a living memorial. Monks recited daily prayers for souls lost on that land. Pilgrims visited. Families donated money to ensure prayers never stopped. These places became spiritual anchors for entire regions. Architecture remembered the dead. Battlefield chapels emerged, small stone structures marking where kings, nobles, or groups of soldiers fell. Some were tiny, barely large enough for a priest. Others became major sites of pilgrimage. Inside these chapels, shields were hung as offerings. Helmets were placed on altars. Lists of names were carved into walls. Bones of unknown soldiers were kept as relics. These were among Europe's first war memorials, centuries before modern monuments. Epic literature immortalized the fallen. Works like the Song of Roland, Beowulf, Nibelungen and Lied, and the Song of the Cid shaped how societies remember defeated or fallen warriors. These stories blended truth with exaggeration, turning battlefield deaths into acts of martyrdom, moments of divine intervention, heroic last stands, moral lessons, national myths. And yet behind the poetry, you can still sense the reality. Bodies left on fields, friends lost, enemies unknown, mass graves beneath travelers' feet. These epics transformed tragedy into identity. Kings used the dead to shape political narratives. Medieval rulers understood something essential. How you tell the story of the dead can shape the living. If a king wanted to appear merciful, he emphasized how respectfully he buried enemy dead. If he wanted to appear ruthless, he reminded people how enemy bodies had been left for wolves. Chroniclers acted like medieval media. They described burial scenes with political intention. Imagine reading a royal account that says, "Not a single corpse was left unblessed under the compassionate eye of the king." Or another that says, "The rebels were denied burial. Their bodies rotted in the fields as a sign of divine judgment." These descriptions weren't about accuracy. They were about power. Funeral traditions evolved because of war. The scale of battlefield death forced changes in civilian burial customs. Mass graves during wars normalized. Communal burials, ossuaries, bone vaults, quick rites, simplified funerals. Even plague pits during the Black Death echoed battlefield burials. And after the plague, many traditions, such as corpse candles, bells for souls, and prayers for the dead, strengthened because people were so accustomed to large-scale death. It's no exaggeration to say, medieval battlefield practices influenced how Europe handled death itself. Memorial days and anniversaries began to form. Long before national holidays existed, medieval communities marked battle anniversaries. Villages near battlefields held processions, prayer services, candle vigils, feasts honoring fallen relatives. These weren't celebrations of victory. They were acts of remembrance, and families kept these traditions alive for generations. Battlefields became teaching tools. Medieval kings brought young princes to ancient battlefields to teach them about consequences of war, bravery, sacrifice, leadership, divine judgment. Priests used battlefield stories to preach about humility and morality. Minstrels used them to warn listeners about the fragility of life. Teachers used them to explain history and lineage. Even centuries later, farmers plowing old battlefields found bones and paused, not out of fear, but respect. By this point, it's clear that battlefields were not just scenes of violence. They were foundations upon which medieval culture was built. The dead shaped laws, beliefs, architecture, legends, identity. But we still haven't answered one more crucial part of the story. How did medieval leaders, religious orders, armies, and ordinary people decide which bodies were worth honoring and which were forgotten? When we imagine a battlefield, we often picture thousands of bodies lying together, equal in death, indistinguishable in mud and blood. But the truth is far more complicated. In medieval society, death did not erase hierarchy. In fact, it reinforced it. This part of the story explores something both fascinating and unsettling: how medieval people decided who deserved honor, who deserved a proper burial, and who was forgotten in the earth. Even after death, rank, wealth, loyalty, religion, and even ethnicity shaped a soldier's fate. Let's step into this uncomfortable truth. Nobles, the valuable dead. For nobles, death was not the end of influence. It was the beginning of an administrative and political storm. When a noble fell in battle, everything shifted. His titles were now in limbo. His lands needed a new owner. His vassals needed direction. His king needed certainty. His family needed closure. That is why nobles received immediate attention. Their bodies were searched for personal seals, signet rings, banners, or heraldic symbols. They were identified quickly because mistakes could collapse entire lineages. Noblemen were cleaned, blessed, wrapped, transported, mourned, honored. Sometimes even enemies treated noble corpses with respect. Rival lords returned bodies under truce, knowing that one day their own families might need the same courtesy. It wasn't just honor, it was politics. A noble buried with dignity meant peace. A noble left for scavengers meant war. Knights, the middle tier. Knights weren't as politically significant as nobles, but they were still valuable. Their families often expected their bodies to be returned, or at least buried separately from common soldiers. Knights were often buried in small marked graves, near chapels, with armor placed beside them, with prayers said by chaplains, with their shields or banners marking the spot. Even when not returned home, knights received burial attempts that acknowledged their status. A knight's shield might be broken and placed on his grave. A sword might be stuck into the soil above him. A cross might be improvised from spears. These symbols mattered to medieval culture. They signaled identity, lineage, and faith. Common soldiers, the forgotten majority. Now we reach the harsh reality. The vast majority of medieval fighters were peasants, laborers, tenants, seasonal levies, poor foot soldiers, hired hands. Their deaths didn't shift kingdoms. Their absence didn't change political landscapes. Most didn't carry seals or banners. Many didn't even have surnames recorded. For them, burial was practical, not ceremonial, tossed into mass graves. No markers, no prayers, unless a priest was present, no identification, no protection from scavengers, not separated by nationality or loyalty. Mass graves were a mixture of friends, enemies, Christians, non-Christians, sometimes all thrown together in pits dug too shallow, too rushed, too exhausted. It wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. But centuries later, when archaeologists dig up these pits, the differences are obvious. Noble graves, organized, clean, individual. Knightly graves, carefully arranged. Common graves, jumbled piles of bones, limbs intertwined. Skulls broken, bodies crushed under layers. It tells a story about medieval values, without needing a single word. Mercenaries, the disposable dead. Mercenaries had a unique fate. In many medieval kingdoms, mercenaries were distrusted, feared, resented, considered dishonorable, punished even in death. When mercenaries died, soldiers often left them unburied entirely. Chroniclers describe ravens and wolves feasting on mercenary corpses because no one wanted to touch them, not out of fear but disdain. Some kingdoms even passed laws refusing burial rights to certain mercenary companies. Their death was considered the end of a contract. Nothing more, nothing less. Religious differences, burial as a barrier, battles between Christians and Muslims, especially during Crusades, produced complex burial politics. Christian dead were often buried separately from Muslim dead. Muslims had strict burial rules that Crusaders didn't understand. Christians insisted on burials with crosses. Muslims insisted on burials facing Mecca. In some crusade battles, Muslim bodies were burned by Christians, a major spiritual offense. Christian bodies were stripped and left by Muslim victors. Each side refused to bury the other. Mass pits contained two religions separated by rock lines. Burial wasn't just about death. It was about identity. Heretics, rebels, and traitors, the forbidden dead. Some soldiers were denied burial entirely. If a soldier was classified as a heretic, a traitor, an excommunicated man, a rebel against the crown, a criminal hired to fight, then their bodies were left on the field. Their graves were not blessed. Animals disposed of them. The land they died on was considered cursed. Families were often forbidden to recover them. This wasn't just punishment. It was symbolic erasure. To deny burial was to deny memory. And medieval societies believed the soul of such a man wandered eternally, unable to rest. Burial honors for the poor, rare but powerful. Though uncommon, there were moments when common soldiers were honored. After the Battle of Courtrai, 1302, the Flemish dead were treated with reverence. The people saw their fallen as defenders of liberty. Bells rang for days. Priests performed mass burials with respect. Families brought candles. Graves were marked. This shows us something essential. Honor didn't come from status. It came from meaning. If a community believed a soldier died for them, they honored him, noble or not. This is one of the most beautiful truths hidden in medieval history. Battlefield chaplains and the last blessing. Chaplains sometimes moved quickly across the battlefield whispering blessings over the dead, especially if they believed. Souls were trapped. Ghosts would linger. God's judgment needed appeasement. Soldiers died unconfessed. Even if they couldn't bury every man, chaplains tried to give him something, a prayer, a sign of the cross, a whispered Latin verse. This was the medieval version of giving dignity to the forgotten. Archaeological evidence confirms medieval inequality. Excavations reveal the truth starkly. Nobles buried with care, knights with weapons or armor fragments, common soldiers piled or tossed, mass graves mixed and crushed, disarticulated bones from rush burial, multiple pits layered years apart, children who served as squires buried beside nobles, stray dogs' teeth marks on abandoned corpses, skeletons with missing limbs or heads, pits containing both horses and humans. Bones don't lie. Neither do burial patterns. They reveal a world where honor survived death, and inequality did too. But there's one more layer we must explore. How did medieval armies prepare for battlefield death before the fighting even began? Yes, there were plans, rituals, strategies, and even rules about where soldiers would be buried, how their belongings would be handled, and how commanders dealt with death during ongoing campaigns. Before medieval battles started, before swords clashed, before the first arrow flew, the soldiers already knew one truth. Many of them would not return. Death wasn't a possibility. It was an expectation. And because of that, medieval armies developed a series of rituals, preparations, and emotional acts that shaped how they faced their final moments. This part of the story reveals something most people never think about. The dead were planned for before the first blow was struck. Let's go back to the hours before battle, when fear, faith, and final choices fill the air. Final confessions and the weight of sin. On the morning of battle, priests became the most important figures in the army. Soldiers lined up, sometimes hundreds at a time, to confess their sins. They believed dying unconfessed meant eternal danger, wandering as a restless spirit, facing divine judgment or being denied heaven. Priests moved quickly, hearing rapid confessions, blessing groups of men at once, sprinkling holy water, giving last rites preemptively, urging soldiers to forgive enemies, offering comfort to trembling boys barely old enough to fight. Some priests literally walked row by row whispering, "Prepare your soul." That sentence alone shows how much the dead were already part of the battle before it began. Writing wills and last messages. Nobles and knights often wrote wills, known as testaments, the night before a major battle. These documents included land inheritance, debts owed, forgiveness of grievances, burial wishes, requests for masses to be said for their souls, instructions to their armor, banners, or war horses. Some wrote secret messages to wives or lovers. Some wrote apologies. Some wrote farewells. And many common soldiers who couldn't write spoke their wishes aloud to friends, hoping someone would remember. Imagine a 19-year-old peasant saying, "If I fall, tell my mother I died bravely." Or a knight whispering, "If I do not return, bury my heart in my homeland." These words followed survivors for the rest of their lives. Emotional farewells among comrades. Medieval soldiers formed bonds like family. They marched together, slept side by side, shared food, and fought shoulder to shoulder. The night before battle, men embraced, shared their fears, made promises. Friends vowed to protect each other, to carry each other off the field if wounded, to return home together, to bury each other properly, or to deliver last messages to families. Some even exchanged tokens, rings, scraps of cloth, small carvings. So if one died, the other could return it to their family. These weren't dramatic gestures. They were survival rituals. The ritual of preparing the body before death. Medieval warriors believed that how they died mattered spiritually. So many performed physical rituals before battle, washing their faces, cleaning their weapons, straightening their clothing, tying belts tighter, adjusting armor, combing hair, touching religious pendants, kissing icons or crucifixes. They wanted to die in order, not disheveled, not dishonored, not unprepared. This shows how deeply burial customs shaped the mind of a soldier before they even stepped onto the field. The vow of battle companions. Knights often made formal vows, sometimes dramatic, sometimes simple. Examples included, "We shall live or die together. If I fall, carry my banner home. Should you outlive me, see me buried with honor." Some knights swore oaths on relics or holy books. If one broke such a vow, it was seen as a moral failure and spiritually dangerous. These vows linked men together in ways that would define how their bodies were treated afterward. Commanders planning for death logistically. Kings and commanders weren't sentimental. They needed practical plans. Before major battles, they often decided where burial pits would be dug, how to identify nobles, where chaplains would stand during the fight, how to handle wounded, which squires would retrieve bodies, which carts or pack animals would carry corpses, how to separate enemies from allies, how to recover banners and symbols of rank. War wasn't chaos. It was organized death. Some kings even built temporary wooden chapels near the battlefield in advance. So priests had a place to perform rites. The armor of the dead. Why knights prepared carefully. Knights wore personalized armor, and this mattered because armor helped identify bodies. Family crests signal rank. Custom pieces marked lineage. Decorations showed affiliation. Knights knew their armor was their identity. They wanted to be recognizable, so their bodies could be honored, claimed, and buried properly. A knight dying unidentified was one of the deepest fears in medieval warfare. Superstitions about dying without burial. Medieval soldiers were extremely superstitious. They feared dying on cursed ground, dying with their eyes open, dying far from home, dying without last rites, their bodies being left for wolves, their souls wandering the earth, being buried with enemies, being buried face down, a sign of shame. Some men carried small talismans, a sprig of rosemary, a saint's medal, or a pebble from their home village, believing it would protect them in death. Leaders giving final speeches that acknowledged death. Before some battles, kings spoke openly about death. At Agincourt, Henry V told his men that dying in glory would make them immortal. At Poitiers, the Black Prince warned many would not live to see sunrise. At Athene, Crusader leaders told their men to confess because death was certain. At Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce urged his warriors to remember the ancestors buried in Scottish soil. These speeches weren't just motivation, they were preparation. They acknowledged death as a companion marching beside every soldier. Religious orders and the warrior's last prayer. Military orders like the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Order, the Hospitallers, had specific prayers to prepare for death. Lord, should my body fall, guide my soul to your light. Let my death be honorable. Grant that I may not be lost in the wild fields. These orders believed burial was not just about respect. It was a spiritual duty. Why understanding these preparations matters? Because everything we've covered in parts 1 to 8, the burials, mass graves, rituals, abandonment, honor, and dishonor, makes more sense when you realize the soldiers expected these outcomes. They planned their own deaths. They feared specific fates. They prepared for the treatment of their bodies long before the battlefield claimed them. They weren't just warriors. They were men negotiating with death every time they marched. And yet, there is one final chapter, We still must explore the long-term consequences, the myths that lasted centuries, the relics unearthed by archaeologists, and the lingering presence of the dead in modern Europe. The battle is long over. Centuries pass. The grass grows back. Forests reclaim the edges of old fields. Roads shift. Villages rise and fall. And the thousands of men who once screamed, fought, bled, and died fade from memory. Their bones dissolve into the soil. Their armor rusts into fragments. Their names vanish. But even though time tries to erase them, the dead never fully disappear. Their presence lingers in the most unexpected ways. When farmers dig wells and hit skulls instead of stone. When children find arrowheads in the fields after summer rain. When archaeologists pull up bones stacked like firewood. When construction crews uncover mass graves beneath modern cities. When ancient documents mention a battle no one remembered. When DNA tests reveal wounds from forgotten wars. All of it reminds us that long before us, the earth held thousands of silent stories buried just beneath the surface. And these rediscovered stories help answer one last question. What did they truly do with the dead after medieval battles? The answer is more complex than a single description. Battlefields weren't cleaned the same way everywhere. Bodies weren't treated equally. And time itself sometimes became the final undertaker. But something remarkable has happened in our time. Modern archaeology has begun giving identity back to forgotten. In Visby, Sweden, 3 mass graves were uncovered containing hundreds of skeletons from the Battle of 1361. Their bones still carry the marks of the fight. Cleaved skulls, shattered ribs, cut legs still inside greaves. Some bodies were buried with armor still on, suggesting they were dumped so quickly there was no time to strip them. Others were piled in layers, showing how overwhelming the burial efforts must have been. In England, mass graves from the Battle of Toten were uncovered. Skulls showing blows from swords, poleaxes, and arrows. Some men had as many as 12 or more deadly wounds, proving the battle was fought face-to-face and brutally. These bones told stories no chronicle ever recorded. In France, bones from Crécy and Agincourt reveal how rushed the burials were. Bodies were thrown in large pits, often partially decayed before burial began. Animals had scattered limbs. Some skeletons were missing hands or feet, likely cut off during looting or scavenging. Each discovery teaches us the same truth. The medieval world did what it could, but war created more dead than any society could handle with dignity. And yet, there is dignity now. Because when archaeologists uncover these graves, they treat the remains with respect. They analyze wounds, study bones, recreate faces, identify diets, ancestry, age. They turn anonymous dead into people again. A 19-year-old archer, a 40-year-old noble with a healed leg break, a teenage squire buried beside an older knight, a soldier from far away, whose bones show he grew up near the Alps. For centuries they lay silent. Now their stories are whispered through science, preserved in museums, taught in schools, shared in films, honored in documentaries, like the one we're creating right now. The medieval dead are finally being heard. But let's return to the Middle Ages one last time, to how communities live with the memory of battle. Sometimes villages avoided farmland where soldiers once fell, believing the ground was spiritually heavy. Other times they farmed it anyway, knowing the soil was richer from the organic matter of thousands of decomposed bodies. Medieval people understood death as part of the land. They lived with the dead, prayed for the dead, feared the dead, and in a strange way, coexisted with them. Even centuries later, people believed that spirits wandered old battlefields. Travelers swore lights flickered where mass graves lay. Shepherds claimed to hear cries during foggy nights. Soldiers marching through old battlefields in later wars reported unease, as if walking through layers of history. Whether these were ghosts or simply echoes of memory didn't matter. The feeling was real. Some places built chapels on battlefields so monks could pray daily for souls long forgotten. Some placed stone markers or simple wooden crosses. Some held annual processions, long after the last eyewitness had died. The dead shaped the living. Their presence made battlefields more than just land. They became reminders of human fragility. Even kings understood this. Some refused to fight on ground where great losses had occurred. Others visited battlefields specifically to pray, hoping to avoid repeating the tragedies. Chronicles describe kings kneeling on grass covering thousands of men, humbled by the silence under their feet. And the land itself remembers. Soil chemistry changes. Iron from weapons and armor remains in trace amounts. Human bone turns to minerals, enriching the earth. That is why archaeologists can sometimes identify ancient battlefields by examining the soil alone. The land absorbs the dead, and the living build their world on top of that history, without realizing it. Modern highways pass over forgotten battles. Cities sit atop old mass graves. Parks, neighborhoods, schools, all built on ground once soaked in blood. It's not morbid. It's simply the truth of human history. But knowing that truth connects us more deeply to the people who lived before us. Those soldiers, noble or common, knight or peasant, victor or defeated, were human. They laughed. They prayed. They loved. They feared. They hoped to survive. And in death, they left behind lessons etched into bone. Lessons about loyalty. Lessons about ambition. Lessons about tragedy. Lessons about the cost of power. Lessons about the brutality of war. Their silence teaches us more than their voices ever could. And if we listen closely, we understand that medieval people didn't just bury the dead. They carried them spiritually through generations. They told stories. They built rituals. They prayed for souls. They shaped laws. They created legends that outlived empires. The dead influenced architecture, politics, religion, burial customs, and cultural memory. They shaped borders. They changed dynasties. They inspired epics. They fueled pilgrimages. They haunted imaginations. They taught commanders how to lead, taught priests how to comfort, taught families how to mourn. The medieval world was built not just on the actions of the living, but on the weight of the dead resting beneath every field and forest. And now, as we uncover their remains centuries later, we become part of that long chain of memory. We honor them by telling their story, accurately, respectfully, and with the empathy that time denied them. Their bones are silent, but their story still speaks. And before we close this journey, take a moment to imagine a single medieval soldier, the kind whose name no one recorded. A young man standing on a field at dawn, his breath visible in the cold air, the sound of distant horns calling his army into position, fear pressing into his chest, a prayer forming in his mind, the future unknown. Hours later, he lies still. No one knows who he was. No one knows where he came from. No one knows what he dreamed of. No one tells his family where he fell. But today, right now, his story is being remembered. That alone gives meaning to the centuries he spent forgotten. So if you stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you. And if you want more deep dives into real history, strange truths, and the human stories behind the past, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what topic you want us to explore next. And wherever you are watching from, morning, afternoon, midnight, thank you for spending your time with me. Let's meet again in the next story.